Welcome to One Step Past, and this is
Action Heroes of History, Elizabeth Van Lew, Spymaster, Postmaster.
She is one of the most interesting Civil War heroes you probably never heard about. Elizabeth Van Lew was the greatest spy for the Union Army. She was later made a postmaster by President Grant himself as repayment for her services. Elizabeth deserved more, but she didn't do what she did for fame and glory. Since Elizabeth lived in the South at the time of her spy activities, it wasn't wise for her to let anyone know what she was doing. After the Civil War, she continued to live in the South, but it still wasn't smart for her to boast about her assistance to the North. Elizabeth's early days. Elizabeth Van Lew was born to a wealthy family on October 12, 1818, in Richmond, Virginia. Her father, John, owned a thriving hardware business. He also owned several slaves. Elizabeth's mother, Eliza, had always been against slavery and despised the fact that her husband was a slave owner. Eliza's father, Hilary Baker, was the abolitionist mayor of Philadelphia for a few years. Elizabeth's hatred of slavery was instilled in her from an early age. The young Elizabeth was sent to a Quaker school in Philadelphia for her education. Quakers were Protestant Christians who greatly opposed war and violence. Slavery, for sure, was a big no-no for them. Going to a Quaker school only reinforced Elizabeth's abolitionist beliefs. Elizabeth came home from school and was groomed to be a Southern belle in high society. There were a few things going against Elizabeth. Not to be mean, but she wasn't a beauty queen. In addition, her northern sympathies scared off any would-be Southern gentlemen. She was also way too socio-political to be thought of as fun. Elizabeth wasn't a good-time girl, and she wasn't all about staying in the kitchen and raising children. She never married. Daddy dies. Out go the slaves. Elizabeth was 24 when her father died in 1843. Right away, Elizabeth and her mother freed the family slaves. The majority of these slaves continued on as paid servants. At the time, there was a depression going on. Elizabeth used her entire cash inheritance of $10,000 to purchase and free some of their former slaves' relatives. Elizabeth's brother John even got in on the act. He would go to the slave market in Richmond, buy a slave family that was about to be split up, then set them free. In addition, Elizabeth and her surviving family would help their freed slaves find places to live and paying jobs. She was really committed to her beliefs and was greatly self-sacrificing. Elizabeth the Spy. As soon as the American Civil War started in 1861, Elizabeth and her mother did their part to help the Union and care for their wounded soldiers. This did not endear them to their fellow citizens in Richmond, Virginia. Early on, Elizabeth knew she was playing a risky game, especially since Richmond was the capital city of the Confederacy. When Libby Prison was opened in Richmond, Elizabeth was allowed to visit the Union soldiers imprisoned there. She brought them food, clothing, writing paper, and other things. Although Elizabeth passed this off as a humanitarian effort, she did have ulterior motives. She helped prisoners escape and gave them information about safe houses they could go to. Elizabeth even went so far as to help get a Union sympathizer appointed to the prison staff. Union soldiers who would get captured would immediately inform Elizabeth on Confederate troop levels and movements. She would pass this information on to Union commanders. Elizabeth took it even one step further and helped hide Union prisoners as well as Confederate deserters in her own mansion. Benjamin Butler. In December 1863, 2 Union soldiers that had escaped Libby Prison with Elizabeth's help told Major General Benjamin F. Butler about her. Butler was impressed. He sent one of the men back to meet her with orders to recruit her as a spy. Elizabeth agreed and became Butler's top spy in Richmond. Now she was doing spy stuff in an official capacity. At this point, it needs to be made clear that Elizabeth did not hate the South or the Confederates. She simply didn't like slavery and didn't want anyone to be fighting. Elizabeth was doing her part in getting the war to end sooner and possibly save some lives in the process. This was a dark time in America's history. The Richmond Underground. Sounds like the name of a rock group, doesn't it? The Richmond Underground was, in fact, the name of Elizabeth's spy ring. Its base of operations was the Van Lew Mansion. Elizabeth Van Lew quickly became the top spy for the Union Army. Her spy network was far-reaching. It included people who worked in the War and Navy departments of the Confederacy, as well as a Richmond mayoral candidate. One of Elizabeth's biggest helpers was Varina Davis, the wife of Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Varina herself did not know it. Mary Bowser and Varina Davis. One of Elizabeth's top operatives was a black woman by the name of Mary Bowser. Mary was, at one time, a slave of the Van Lew family who Elizabeth had freed. The grateful former slave remained faithful to Elizabeth and served her well. Mary was hired by Varina Davis as a household servant. This allowed Mary to spy freely in the White House of the Confederacy. After the Civil War, when it was revealed that Mary was a Union spy, Varina fiercely denied ever hiring her. There are a few reasons for that. One, Mary Bowser used a lot of different names. She was, after all, a working spy. In addition, if you hired an enemy spy, would you want to admit it? At any rate, Mary Bowser's work as a Union spy was very important. Elizabeth's sneaky tricks. Elizabeth only recruited people she trusted, including men, women, and children. She had over a dozen spies in her employ, black and white. Much of her information was gathered by black people. Besides Libby Prison, spies were also placed at other prisons like Castle Thunder and Belle Island. Servants who lived at Van Lew Mansion ran errands that seemed innocent, but were actually quite dangerous. Elizabeth and her spies knew it meant death if they were caught in the act. Some messages to the Union were written in code. These codes would be written in a colorless liquid that would only turn black when combined with milk. The messages would be sewn into the clothing of the servants or hidden in the thick, hollow soles of their shoes. One of the more unusual ways of passing messages was through hollowed-out eggs. Prisoners would be loaned books from the Van Lew private library that would, surprise, surprise, be hiding messages. Elizabeth would receive replies in the same manner. Trusted servants driving wagons of fresh farm products would go across enemy lines on a daily basis to General Grant's headquarters at City Point in Virginia. Obviously, they gave Grant correspondence, plans, and maps. These wagons also concealed Union prisoners and slaves who escaped to freedom. Under suspicion. Everyone in Richmond knew Elizabeth and her mother were Union sympathizers. The local community kept a loose association with the Van Lews. A lot of people suspected Elizabeth of her help to the North, but no one knew for sure. They definitely did not know the extent of what she was doing. Confederate guards regularly searched for anything they could find to arrest her, but they never found anything. She even continued to hide escaped prisoners in her attic. During the entire course of the war, Elizabeth had to endure death threats from people who meant it. Elizabeth's powerful friends. Being the head of the Union's biggest spy network was naturally going to put Elizabeth in the same circle as the Union's most powerful men. We know about Benjamin Butler, who made Elizabeth Van Lew an official spy. But who were the other notables? Elizabeth and Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant were so tight that she sent him fresh flowers from her garden along with copies of the Richmond newspaper. He told Elizabeth directly that she was his most valuable spy. Another powerful ally was General George H. Sharp, intelligence officer for the Army of the Potomac. Sharp's organization was originally called the Secret Service Department before it was renamed to BMI, Bureau of Military Information. Later on, in 1865, a different Secret Service was established. Sharp admitted outright that Elizabeth was the Union's greatest resource of information. He recommended to the United States government that Elizabeth be paid $15,000. Elizabeth had spent a lot of her own money in the war effort and employed spies. Sadly, the government refused. There is no good excuse for that. Elizabeth's contributions were essential to the Union war effort, and the government failed her. The Civil War ends. The Union Army overtook Richmond, Virginia in April 1865. Confederate soldiers, suspecting that Elizabeth had a hand in their great defeat, were about to set fire to her mansion. All this time, Elizabeth had been careful not to mention any of her spy activities or association with Union officers. This time, however, Elizabeth called out the soldiers by name, because she knew who they were, and told them if they didn't leave her property, General Grant would take care of them himself. Not only was she very brave in telling this to the rebels, she spoke the truth. If any harm came to Elizabeth, Grant would be very, very upset. Grant sent 2 of his staff officers to Elizabeth's mansion as bodyguards and told them to do anything she asked. Elizabeth was safe for now, but her life would not be easy from here on. She insisted on staying in Richmond. It was her home. However, she was totally ostracized by the community, and it got nothing but worse until she died. She had lost all of her social standing and almost all of her money. Money became a big problem for Elizabeth. The American government could have and should have done better by her. Grant was able to get her a small one-time stipend of $2,000, and that was it. Some of the Union soldiers she helped during the war came from wealthy families, and they would regularly give her money. On top of financial worries, the government was releasing too much information about Elizabeth's wartime activities. This only made her life in Richmond more difficult, and she desperately tried to keep any more information about her spying adventures from becoming public. From Spymaster to Postmaster. When Ulysses S. Grant became president in 1869, he very quickly made Elizabeth Van Lew the postmaster of the Richmond, Virginia post office. Grant never forgot Elizabeth, and he tried to do his best by her. Why postmaster, though? At the time, the highest civilian office a woman could hold was a postmaster appointment. It paid an annual salary of $4,000. Although Elizabeth deserved much more, at least she got this much. At the time, it was pretty good pay. While Grant was president from 1869 to 1877, Elizabeth held the office of postmaster. When Rutherford B. Hayes became president, she immediately lost her job and was hard up for money again. She never had much money ever again. Elizabeth was, however, allowed to return as a postal clerk from 1883 to 1887. One thing was for certain, Elizabeth made a very, very good postmaster. This might seem strange, since she was just dropped into this job, but she ran the post office as efficiently as her spy network. The Richmond post office expanded and modernized. She brought free city delivery to the post office. She also employed a number of black people who were paid the same as white people. Women were also hired. These things were revolutionary at the time. Training of postal employees was greatly improved. Straight up, under Elizabeth's command, the Richmond post office ran like a clock. In her first 2 years on the job, mail volume increased 5 times over. Elizabeth's final days. Elizabeth Van Lew was a woman ahead of her time. For her entire life, she worked hard to advance the rights of blacks and women. People in Richmond, Virginia viewed her as too radical, actually nicknaming her Crazy Bet. Friendships and relationships with people in this town were not going to happen. In her later years, her constant companion was a niece named Eliza Van Lew, after Elizabeth's mother. Elizabeth's niece died in 1900. Just 2 months later, in the same year, Elizabeth died at the age of 81. During Elizabeth's lifetime, she didn't want anyone to know what she had done during the war. She was proud of what she did, however, and kept journals. In her will, she allowed her manuscripts to be made public. In 1911, the city of Richmond acquired the Van Lew mansion and demolished it. It was such a long time since the Civil War, and people in that city still hated her. That was entirely disrespectful. The Bellevue Elementary School was erected on the property and still remains as of 2022. Since then, historical plaques and a marker were placed to honor Elizabeth Van Lew. In 1993, Elizabeth was inducted into the Military Intelligence Hall of Fame. Elizabeth Van Lew, quite frankly, was trailblazing in everything she ever did. Spymaster, Postmaster, abolitionist, and a social reformer for black people and women. She pushed the limits of what a woman could do. It makes you wish she was treated better by the general public in her lifetime. Hopefully, wherever Elizabeth is right now, she knows that what she did accomplished something. Elizabeth wasn't a fighter in the traditional sense, but she did fight for change and put herself at great personal risk. Anyone who does this deserves to be called a true action hero of history.